there are an enormous amount of books and articles, essays written on these topics. Of course, I can't be exhaustive. I apologize.
Are you recording?
I am. And, for example, Raymond Brown's book, The Birth of the Messiah. I don't remember now. I think it was 500 or 700 pages. I read that in my undergrad. And, I mean, these are just huge amount of literature written on the topic. So what I want to do, instead of going through every single possible, I just want to highlight some major things, if that's okay, in Matthew's version and then Luke's version. And then we can always discuss whatever you want to discuss. And I do this study because, well, I did it because Elaine suggested it. You've got to do it. So yes, ma'am. But also because in this time of year, I think it's a good one to go back. We're going to hear these stories a lot in churches. That's one reason. So one, she told me to. Two, we hear a lot of it. The third reason is because, respectfully and frankly, I've never heard this taught correctly. And I hate it when I have to say that so often, but it's just the case. Some things I've heard churches do well. But what's happened over the last couple centuries in the Western church, at least, so the English-speaking church, is these church legends on all kinds of different issues have arisen, and this is no different. In fact, lends itself to a lot of legends. Things like innkeepers and whole dramas and plays and musicals and songs about there's no room here. And then the one that came out a few years ago of Jesus, Joseph and Mary, and she's pregnant on a donkey, and please hurry, and the water's about to break, and the drama and on and on. It's just unfortunate because none of that's in the Bible. None of it is. And so we have three wise kings. No, they're not. They have names. No, they don't. I mean, I could go down the whole list. We have song. We three kings of Orient aren't. We're not from there. They're not kings. And so I'm going to go through examples of this kind of stuff that we've heard. And it's hard for me personally. I'm a human being, not a robot. It's difficult sometimes for me, except I've been teaching this for so many years. It's a little easier to rip back the nonsense and go back behind all the layers of legend that keep increasing, it seems, as the time goes on, especially with social media and movies and TVs, to make it dramatic. We have to add stuff that's just not there. The texts themselves simply are not that dramatic. They're important. They make very important points, but they're just not that dramatic. They make points that a first century Jewish and then Greco-Roman, for Luke's audience would have really appreciated. And my view is, when it comes to scripture, if you know me enough by now, is I want to hear what they had to say first to their first original audience and realize, why did you say that way? The problem is, I'm not a first century Jew. So what Matthew says isn't very exciting to me on an emotional level. I appreciate it. I respect it. But I don't go, man, it moved me. And so I have to make up a brand new sitcom that tells me all the stuff that would make it dramatic. This seems to me that's what's taken place. Luke's gospel isn't that different either. So what I want to do is, and really maybe in 30 minutes each gospel, just reflect on some stuff, and then we can piggyback on that. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. The intro, that's my intro. Matthew chapter 1. It's the first sentence that says so much about this introduction. The book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. In fact, many Jews call Genesis the book of genealogies. It's to talk about the origin of things, and the word is genesios. Sometimes the word Genesis, that's where the word Genesis comes from. But the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's exactly what he's about to unpack. How is it that Yeshua, which means, of course, Yahweh saves, Yahweh Savior. How is it that Jesus is the Messiah, which means he's the son of David, which means he's related? When it says son of David, of course, just to be clear, son of David does not mean he's literally David's son. It's a way of saying he's from the genealogical records. He's related. That's it. He's related to David. If you're a Jew, the Jews that did believe in a Messiah, which is a king figure, those that did, and not all of them did, the Jews that did believe in that said he has to come from the line of David. He has to be a, quote, son. Could be a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of David, but he's going to have to be. Why? Because that, they said, read 2 Samuel 7. Read the Old Testament text where God the Father promises someone from your line will sit on the throne forever. Well, that's not what happened in Samuel's time. It didn't happen. Israel got destroyed and they were exiled. Didn't happen. So what Jews did was saying, what he really must mean is, at some point, God will establish his earthly lineage, a king, and last forever. So this opening sentence really sets the stage for what probably Matthew's church, literally his Jewish Christian origin church, what they thought about Jesus. And they're speaking of ways about Jesus that are both true, but very important for his audience. That Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah, which means he has to be from the son of David, the lineage of David. And Matthew's going to, and then he'll back that up in a second. And then he's the son of Abraham. This next genealogy and story in chapter 1, the rest of the verses, from verses 2 through 17, is to make sure you understand he's from the lineage of Abraham. 18 to 25 lets you know that he's from the lineage of David. So this opening, what we might call birth narrative, but it's really not a birth narrative because almost nothing is said about his birth. In Matthew and Luke, I want that to sink in. Matthew and Luke say very little, and I mean very little, about anything surrounding the birth of Jesus, the actual birth itself. Nothing is said of the birth itself. Very little is said about the events around the birth itself. What it talks about are the characters that are involved in this whole narrative. The characters involved. So it's not about the birth of Jesus. We say that, I understand, in churches, we're going to reflect on the birth of Jesus. But the fact is, there's not one single verse that says how or when he was born. David, what about, well, after him in the waddling cloth? We'll go there, that's Luke's. But even Luke does not tell us that. And I'll prove it to you by saying it's not there. You'll see. My point is, there's a lot we just don't know. And Matthew and Luke did not want to tell us that. And what they did want to tell us are different things. Matthew wants us to hear, because of his Jewish Christian background, Matthew wants us to hear how it is that Jesus is from the lineage of Abraham and related to King David. That's it. That's the main things he wants. And he does it many, many different ways, and I'll emphasize that now. Okay, so that's the opening verse. I'm not going to go that slow, but I'm telling you that's verse 1. It is important. Now, verses 2 through 5, well, 2 through 6, really. Verses 2 through 6 are roughly 14 generations. So Abraham, verse 2, Abraham. So Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, and on and on. Okay, I'm going to emphasize, I'm not going to read all those words. You can if you want. Genealogies, who gives a rip? Well, in the ancient world, you care about genealogies because of several reasons. One, it shows your lineage. If you were of royalty, you had to have those. Most people who cared about genealogies in the ancient world were priests or kings. And most people kept records of those things at the temple. Most people in the ancient world did not keep records for almost anything unless it had to do official, you might say official government business. And they were stored at the quote-unquote government library, which is usually in the back of the temple. Sometimes they had private libraries. A little footnote, that's one reason why people go, well, yeah, if Jesus was such a big deal, why don't the Greeks, Romans talk about him everywhere? Because they didn't write about everything that occurred in history. Most writing only occurred by the elite for the elite. And these records were only pulled out when you need to prove someone was related to someone. Genealogies in Judaism weren't that different. Why try to prove someone's related to someone if you're trying to establish their king? In fact, the fact that Jesus' family was linked to King David, which we'll get to in a second, caused trouble for his relatives even through the 2nd century, until the last living relative of Jesus died off. So that there's genealogies demonstrate pedigree. That's especially for royalty. 2, they can be used to demonstrate inheritance. Who gets what? And you have to prove that by showing genealogy. And 3rd, in Judaism, this is quite common. Genealogy can help demonstrate what they would say probably is character. We might say, we don't say this much in America. And in the South, they kind of do sometimes. But they'll say, he's from good pedigree. It's that kind of idea that you come from good kinfolk. We've always been good teachers. We've all been good blue-collar workers. That's who we are. We're whatever. That's an ancient idea around the globe, but Jews are no different. And a genealogy might imply that. So if Jesus is related to Abraham, the father of all nations, that's a good thing. He goes back to Abraham himself, the guy who originally formed a covenant with God. Moreover, Abraham wasn't a Jew. Abraham wasn't a Jew. Remember that? He comes from the land of Ai. And then comes all the way down. Babylon. Babylon. He was way over there. Traveled roughly 3,000 miles when God said, leave your kinfolk and your land and come down here. Most scholars think that's on purpose. Matthew could have chosen any ancestor to start with. Why did he start with Abraham? Probably to demonstrate that's exactly what will happen in Jesus' ministry. He will be focused on the outsiders. Eventually, God's kingdom will be for the Gentiles. That will also be the point where the Magi come. It's also the point why these women are used, almost certainly. If you look at Tamar in verse 3, she's in Genesis 38. We don't know who Perez is. Don't know that. Tamar's in Genesis 38. You go down to verse 5, Rahab, and yeah. And I'm sorry, I can't read my notes there. Then you have Ruth and Bathsheba. They're in 2 Samuel 11, chapters 11 to 12. You have these women listed, the 4 total. 3 are Gentiles. 1's associated with a Gentile. But all 4 also have a little bit irregular unions with their men. Now, you don't usually mention women in a genealogy in Judaism, but he did. So I go on the list of all these, why mention that person? Why mention the women? Why mention the whatever? It's on purpose. This is not Matthew sitting around going, okay, let's start from the beginning. And there's 5,000 generations, let's get it all right. He's making a theological point. The people he excludes, the people he includes, he wants them to be 14 generations, and he wants to include just certain people. And the fact that he includes these women, most of whom are Gentiles, most of them have irregular unions. That sounds like Mary and Joseph with their irregular union. Gentiles, of course, because at the end of the gospel, remember Matthew 28, 19 and 20? Jesus shows up and says, all authority on earth and heaven has been given to me. What now? As you go to the baptize in the name of all the nations. That means all the Gentiles, what that means. Teaching them to obey everything I commanded. So Matthew bookends the beginning of Matthew and the end of Matthew as the mission of the church is out there. Out there, out there, out there. We could spend a lot more time there if you want. But anyway, so 2 through 6 is 14 generations. Verses 6 through 11 is 14 generations. Verses 12 to 16 are 13 generations. 13 generations. And if you add up all these 14, 14, 14, 14 to be 7 and 7 and 7 and 7 and 7 and 7, that's 6 sevens. Man, almost 7 sevens. And everyone knows 7 is perfect. So if you add that 7. So there are different ways to think about that. Why is it there are 14? Well, roughly. Like in verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. Well, as he outlined them, they were. We don't know anyway. And from
something missed in between.
Right, and not to mention in the Old Testament, you could have grandparents or cousins or uncles. It's just he makes it. Yeah, he wants it to be 14. And from David, great name, to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. See, these are big events. Abraham to David, King David. That's a big epic, a big era. And then King David to the Babylon exile, that's 14 generations. These are huge events in the history of Israel. And then from the deportation of Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. And it really is 13, and then Mary is wife of the 13th, which is Joseph. Now, pause there for a second. Why is there 14? Well, usually most scholars will give one of 2 reasons or both. We just don't know for sure. One explanation is that if you practice what Jews call gematria, is where you know how right now we use numbers. We use Arabic numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We use that's right there, right. So the Arabs invented that. Most people around the globe did not count that way, right? Romans adopted the Arabic numeral system. Well, instead, what they used was they used their letters equaled numbers, called that gematria. So, like if we did A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, 4, and most people in the ancient world did that. In fact, you can go to different places like at Pompeii, where in AD 79, Vesuvius, the volcano, exploded. People they were burned to a crisp in motion, and they still have the motion in the body. And so when they dug through the excavations on trees, some of the cities were in perfect condition, which is amazing. The frescoes and paintings were amazing. And on the trees, etched in the trees, are this kind of gematria stuff. It'd be like 217 heart 314. So some teenagers got their names together and figured out what the numerical value was of their name. That's just like passing notes in class. And if you figured out the code, you know who it was. Well, if you add it up in Hebrew, the numerics, the consonants of Dawid, they would have said Dawid, D-A-V or D-W-D. Those are 3 consonants. If you added those up, and that's what they wrote in Hebrew with consonants. No vowels were added much later when they wrote them. They only wrote consonants. DWD equals 14. And so some say this is just an homage to King David. Like, David, he's related to David, he's related to David. He's trying so hard to say he's from King David. And that is one idea. I mean, that's how not everyone's persuaded, but that is possible. The other possibility is that Matthew is deliberately using 7777 because everybody knew at the time, wink, wink, that phenomenal things happen in 7. And so instead they might say, no, Matthew's just trying to make the point. He wants the people to pick up 1414 and like something big is happening in the grand scheme. Because this is the biggest you can get. Abraham to David to the exile to Jesus. So today Jews would go Abraham to David to exile to what? They wouldn't go to Jesus. They would go to the rabbinic bar. They would go to Yamnia, the supposed starting of the rabbinic school. I mean, they would sound like Jesus is they would say Jesus is a good guy and all. He's a good Jew, but don't put him on David and Abraham's level, for crying out loud. Matthew says, yeah, you should. Yeah, you should. Abraham, Father Abraham, King David. They're culminating. They're going somewhere, progressing, like a rock skipping on a lake of time, and it culminates in Jesus. Because notice, it's not Jesus then 14 more generations. He's the pinnacle of it. And so those are the two major reasons why scholars say that he probably had 14. You might just say, oh no, it's easy to memorize. That was it. I mean, we just don't know for sure. Okay, but David, I don't understand. Because notice that the curveball goes in verse 16. And Yaakov, the father of Joseph, little footnote, and Luke, Joseph's dad, has a different name. Heli. So Jesus' grandfather has a different name in Matthew and in Luke. And there's different explanation for that, and you can go figure that out if you want. I don't know what to do besides there are two names for him. So Jacob, which is one of the most common Jewish names of the time period, the father of Joseph, and typically male boys are named after the father or the grandfather. It's interesting that Jesus is not called Yaakov or Yosef. Who is called Yaakov? And Jesus' family. This is a trick question if you don't know your Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. You should know it. There's an entire book with his name on it. But John. Close. Not John. It doesn't look like the name. James. His name isn't James. Sorry to tip over your sacred cow, but if it is. But yeah, his real name isn't James. His real name is Yaakov. James was introduced in the way to write it in the translations, typically to distinguish between old school Old Testament Jacob versus Jesus' brother. So his name actually isn't James. So in real life, Jesus would have gone around with his brother and called him Yaakov. And Jesus would have been called Yeshua, Yaakov, and so forth. So it's interesting here, of course, in verse 16, Jacob the father of Joseph. That means Jesus' brother was named after his grandfather, according to Matthew. Does that make sense? We're flying with me? And of course, then there's Joseph. But notice it's a left turn, or right turn, whatever. Yaakov the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now, because I didn't read the whole genealogy, it might not stand out to you, but that's weird. All of a sudden, he goes, he's married to Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who's called the Messiah. This whole time it's been patrilineal, father to father, as it basically kind of sort of side of the women. And all of a sudden, we're talking about who he's married to. Well, that seems a bit odd because Matthew's trying so hard to demonstrate that Jesus is from the line of all the way related to Abraham and then David. But that's Joseph who's related to those people, not Mary.
Right.
And the response to that would be, yeah, it still counts because he was adopted. That's the response. That would be the response. He has no problem with that. He has no problem. So his wife, 13, and all the way is the generation all the way to Christ is the 14th. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. Now, I'm still convinced, and most scholars are, if not all of them, are convinced, this story, again, not for the dramatic effect, this next story is trying to demonstrate desperately Jesus is royalty. That if I guess I'm deliberately coloring your view, I'm sorry, but I'm convinced you're supposed to read it that way. Instead of just an old school Christmas narrative, Matthew's not reading like that. He's trying to prove to his Jewish Christian audience that Jesus should be called Messiah because he is Davidic. And this whole narrative is to prove the point. I think that is the purpose. It's not about how he got born. It's not about where he was born. None of that stuff. What matters is the situation around, particularly one person in particular, and it's his earthly father, Joseph. So the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. And it's funny, he never tells us how it took place. He never tells us how the birth took place. He means the event surrounding it. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with a child of the Holy Spirit. What that means, two big things. I'll start at the end of it. Before they came together. What that means is they never had sex before Jesus was born. And that's odd. He didn't have to do that. I don't know of any Jewish law that says you're not supposed to do that. So not only was it a virgin conception, it was generally a virgin birth. That is, when she gave birth, she had never had sex before. And let me say one quick thing about that. Sometimes you'll hear it called the Immaculate Conception, and sometimes frankly, often Protestants don't know what that means. They think Immaculate Conception means virgin birth. It doesn't. Immaculate Conception is a Roman Catholic doctrine that speaks of Mary's sinless state throughout her life, including when the time she bore Jesus. And Jesus didn't come out of her womb. He just supernaturally passed through it. She stayed sealed shut forever. It was the Immaculate Conception. And that comes from a theological belief that, in a deep, deep belief in original sin, which they believe sin is passed down genetically all the way from Adam. Well, if Jesus didn't have sin, Jesus was sinless, and Jesus didn't have an earthly daddy, what must that mean about Mary? She didn't have sin either, because he would have gotten sin from her. If you're like any Protestant, your next question, or maybe a Roman Catholic child, you go, well, how did Mary become sinless? And they say to that, it's a mystery.
That works.
That works, doesn't it? So keep praying to her. It's just a mystery. But that's the Immaculate Conception, is that Mary was sinless. And they would say the proof is she gave birth to Jesus, and he was also sinless, and she had to have been sinless, because otherwise Jesus would have inherited original sin and the guilt of it, and he didn't.
But there's nothing in the Bible about that. That's true.
I don't know anything about original sin. Yeah, I don't know anything. The Bible does teach that humans are sinners. Mm-hmm. I do not find it persuasive that they are born with Adam's sin or Adam's guilt.
About Mary being sinless.
Yeah, there's nothing
That's
biblical.
There
was certain Roman Catholic tradition that she was sinless. That's right. It's not biblical. So, I mean, you can have your view if you want, but it's just not in the Bible. I know that because I've read it before, but it's nowhere. So the first thing is they didn't have sex. That's true. And a corollary is not the Immaculate Conception. That's a Roman Catholic thing. The other thing is Roman Catholics will say that she stayed a virgin. She's immaculate. Because she was just the way it is forever, which means all of Jesus' so-called siblings weren't siblings. They were cousins. So Yaakov, Judas, all these people who are siblings, they weren't brother and sister. So they're going to say, in the New Testament, when the Greek word is used for brother, sometimes it can be used for cousin. Sometimes it can be. And they'll say, see, told you so. That means cousin.
Joseph made a baby with somebody else.
That means you're right. That means that he inherited. Yeah, it was the Brady Bunch, except one-sided. Except one-sided. Protestants historically, and I'm one of them, don't find that persuasive at all, just on linguistic grounds. That's not, almost every time, the brother for brother is brother. Sometimes it can be otherwise. But secularly, I just don't, I think it's merely driven by the need to have Roman Catholic doctrine upheld.
So they're saying when she's in the stable giving birth, it's not giving birth in what we think of giving birth.
Well, correct. Except the text doesn't say she gave birth in a stable, but they would say is when she gave birth, she didn't give birth the way you would or I would. I mean, not sorry, a human. Huh?
Maybe C-section?
Yeah. Supernatural C-section.
Actually, it's an improvement.
Yeah, that's right.
But I mean,
yeah, right, correct. They would say that he supernaturally passed through her womb.
Boy, it beats Lamaze. I mean,
yeah.
Beats.
That's true. No pain. Right?
Beats Lamaze. That's good.
I never thought of it in those terms. Yeah. For Catholics, I guess I was thinking that they're thinking a birth in the same sense that women give birth.
Gotcha. Correct. They do not. Well, that's Roman Catholic doctrine. What the average Roman Catholic on the street believes.
Right.
But that's right. Doctrine. Correct. So an educated Roman Catholic.
Human birth.
Correct.
Probably.
Yes, ma'am. At least I agree with you. I think but the average educated Roman Catholic who knows their doctrine will say what I just said. They would say, no, the Blessed Mary in her sanctified state, remained sinless and a virgin. And the other reason why that, well, there's a bunch. It compounds. She also could not have had sex because the early church father, well, in fact, before the church fathers, early in the early 2nd century onward, we have documents called the Apocryphal Acts, like the Apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apocryphal Act of Andrew, the Apocryphal Act of Thomas. You have all these documents, and we learned early on, they believe in something called syncretism. And, it's hard to say, but the point is, you're not supposed to have sex ever. And they have all these texts. In fact, the earliest known document I know of the time period is called Toward the Virgins. It's still in Greek, but I read chunks of it, and the point is they're extolling wives to stay virgins forever. And if they have already had sex, you're supposed to stop. And so even these apocryphal acts, Paul goes around preaching sermons on how good it is to be sexless in your marriage because everyone knows, they would say, I'm paraphrasing, but this is it, when you have sex, you're enjoying it, which means you must be lusting. And that means you're sinning. Augustine argued for the same thing, except you can have sex to have children, but you're supposed to confess that as sin. You got to repent of it. So this long tradition and Roman Catholic tradition, and I hear this on the TV and movies all the time, and it's so bizarre to me. They'll say, and that kind of stupid puritanical Christian view of sex is dirty. I always go like, what are they talking about? Until I went to school and started reading oh, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about certain Roman Catholic traditions that say that's why, and there is a long tradition in certain early church fathers. Huh?
Just say no.
They would say that, yeah, you can say yes to sex for babies. That's the only time you're supposed to say it. But you're not supposed to enjoy it because that'd be lust, and you don't want to lust when you have sex. And that's also not in the Bible. That's all I was going with that. It's also that's one of the reasons why Mary had to stay a virgin. That's where I was going with that. She has to stay a virgin and sexless forever because she would have never, ever had sex. That'd have been lust, and she was sinless. So you have all these theological views, and it has to be true that kind of logic. None of.
They do still say, I'm trying to think, the rhetoric, and he would know more about, blessed art thou among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb. They still do that in the.
Yeah, well, and of course, they're just quoting Luke 2 there. Luke 1.
Still say the fruit of your womb, so they're still acknowledging some physical.
Yeah, he grew up in the oven. He grew up in Mary's oven. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
2 sinless people. They would say the only 2 sinless people ever.
I always wonder why people pray to Mary if she's just a person.
And they don't think she's just a person.
That
That's
makes more
right.
sense why they would pray to her. Because if
she's
to
a
them,
step
she's not
up.
just a person.
She's a step up.
Yes.
You're right, because she's still.
Yeah,
The only person who'd really understand Jesus is the other sinless person who's walked this earth, which is his mom. And that's the assumption is, if you pray to her, she's got the ear of Jesus. They get it. They're in cahoots, as it were. You say, well, is she not divine? Well, no. That's what they would say. No, she's not divine. But anyway, it's a mystery.
It's always a good fall.
Yeah, I know. I mean, frankly, to me, it's not mystery. It's nonsense. I mean, calling stuff mystery doesn't make it more mysterious or true. It just, but again, that's because, and as a Protestant, Scripture is the chief authority, not just other stuff you start smuggling into it. So they didn't have sex. That's true, but that didn't have to happen. But apparently that's what happened when they were betrothed. Very quick word about that. In Judaism, they called it the kiddushin. That means a betrothal process. And what happened was because of time I can't give all the details, but rarely did people in the ancient world get married, in Judaism particularly, without a lawyer, you might call it. A person who would work with the parents to rig a deal to get people married. And then they would set a price, a dowry, and that's the price of the bride. I have a daughter named Julia, of course, and that means I would pay a gift to the groom for her. Part of it, a big part of it, is to help them go on, is to help them make it. So if I give you some goats or a cow and you usually don't give money because money is usually used for taxes. Currency was hardly ever used except for that. But it'd be usually stuff, and maybe it was fabric and chickens and eggs, things to kind of start a new life. It's basically a wedding shower. That's what a dowry is. But I paid more if she were beautiful. I paid less if people thought she was ugly. And I paid a lot more if she were a virgin. If she were not a virgin, she still could get married, but it's more difficult. And it depends on why. Is she not a virgin because she was married and she's widowed? or is it because she had an affair? So all those kind of things would matter if she were able to get married at all. But that would happen. And this dowry, they called it the mohar. And what they would write up called the ketubin. The ketubin is a wedding contract. And it was real simple. It had to be, I think, 2 witnesses, and then the parties had to get together, figure out how much money it was going to take, and that was it. And so if that sounds business transaction, it's because it was. The point of marriage was to bear children and to keep the family business going. That's it. There's no I love you romance. From the evidence we have, and also based on some common sense, but the evidence we have, it probably was not that common that it happened against their wills. But they did have the authority to say, no, it's going to happen. But the odds are they met each other, they met and they knew each other to some degree. Oh, I grew up around him, or my parents, he's a family friend kind of stuff. And then it was arranged. So unfortunately, the picture of kind of like some slave trade is probably false. But it was not based on dating. You did not date. Dating is a modern convention. You didn't date. You didn't court. Your parents arranged it. And you stayed married forever, except for certain instances. And when you sign that ketubin, that marriage contract, you officially entered into the kiddushin, the betrothal, which is like engagement, but it's more legal. If we had to step up from that, not married, but you're not dating, you're engaged, but it's a legal engagement. The only way to call off an engagement is to get a divorce. In fact, if your spouse dies during this process, you're called a widow. Certain Romans of the time period had introduced by this time period an engagement ring. Not all Romans did it, but Jews almost certainly did not do that. It was more of a private ceremony that you might do, again, in front of witnesses and so forth, but that was it. Then typically what happened is you waited roughly a year. And as far as we can tell, Judea and Galilee had different little rules on this. In Galilee, you're not supposed to be together ever. Apparently in Judea, you could be alone with this person with whom you're engaged. But in Galilee, it was more frowned upon. So the point is probably, in Galilee, where they're from, once you got arranged, you were not alone with that other person at all until the night of the big ceremony. It was roughly a year. You didn't move in together. You didn't dare have sex. You didn't. That was if
How would people be virgin? I mean, how would they not be virgins then, if that's the culture?
How would they not be virgins? Well, I mean, right. Typically, as far as we can tell, the problem is we don't have a lot of evidence. As far as we can tell, though, that would have been common for them to be virgins. Okay. But some girls were easy. Some girls might have been raped, and some girls. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons.
Kill or something for that?
Not killed. You're not killed just because you're not a virgin. Okay. Oh my goodness. Well, not that I mean. And then you wait about a year, and you call the Nisuin was the ceremony we capped. That was you waited. Big ceremony. The more wealthy the family, more prominent, the more people you invited. Smaller for poor people, rich. Jesus gives a lot of parables based on this exact ceremony. And they go off. There's a big ceremony to go off, apparently to get the bride. The groom goes to her house and gets her from the house in the gown and walks back. And people ideally would have the candles waiting to celebrate, come back to the festival. Usually night one was the big celebration, or they would consummate the marriage with sex. And they would come out and maybe show the sheets. I'm sorry, but this is what they would do. And they would herald it, that she is a virgin, yay. And a guy, Shoshaban, was called basically the best man, was related to the groom. It was basically whoever was highest honor amongst his friends would be the guy the master of ceremonies. And if people could afford it, you'd stay for several days up to a week. And basically every day is some kind of celebration party about this new wedding. But night one is when it all got consummated. And then they're married. So Joseph and Mary, to back up now, they're betrothed. So that means almost certainly at some point, Joseph and Mary, and and then Mary's parents would have gotten together and maybe have found a third party to help them negotiate the business contract, wrote up a contract, and the witness of them agreed this was going to happen. They all signed their names. The dowry passed over. I didn't finish my own sentence. The dowry served as a wedding shower. That's why I said that's the benefit. On the other hand, it was a way to help detract divorce. Because if the man divorced, money came back to daddy. So if Julia was dating Bob, and Bob, they got married, and I gave this all my cows, my sheep, my whatever, and then Bob ran off for another woman, he's legally, I got to get all that money back. Even if you spend it, I need the cows back, whatever. And that was a way to help protect her. There was something at stake, because most of the time, only men had the authority to divorce a woman. So it was to, like a baby shower, I mean a wedding shower, but also to help protect. So almost certainly that's what happened with when Jesus was born. His parents had been arranged and got married and waited for a year. And what they're saying here is when they found out, Matthew gave them a summary statement, when she was found to be with a child, they still didn't have sex. They waited and waited and waited. Any questions about that so far? I mean, what that is, that ceremony, the process? Okay, good. Okay, the next verse, verse 19. And her husband, you can call him that, that's fine, her betrothed one, Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. And that's interesting how he says that, because what is he talking about? Why would he do that? Well, in Deuteronomy 22, 23, 27, it talks about what happens if a woman has sex with someone else and you're married. It's a dishonor to the husband when that happens. The reason why a man can get in trouble, and this is hard for modern ears to hear, but virtually all sexual ethics in the ancient world, including in Judaism, that's our Old Testament and New Testament, are not about what happens when a woman does something. It's when a man does something. So to have for example, when Jesus speaks of adultery, if you looked upon lust of a woman, almost certainly when Jesus is saying that, he means when a man has sex with another man's wife. There's a term for that, and it's poikia in Greek. It means adultery. That is to say, it's very rare. They didn't have the word for when a man has sex with a freed woman or an unmarried woman. In fact, the Greeks and Romans did that all the time. All the time. But what's dishonorable is if you have sex with a man's wife, it's dishonorable to the other husband. And that's why they got in trouble, and that's why they had paid fines or got in big trouble. The fact that Joseph knows Mary is pregnant means I'm not the daddy. I know how sex works. I'm not the daddy. And that means I had the right to, in Deuteronomy 22, it was to give her stoned to death because now it's adulterous.
That's what I was thinking.
By this time period, we have first off, we have no evidence in the ancient world that ever happened. All those Old Testament stipulations about homosexuals being stoned and rebellious children being stoned, there's no story ever that it ever occurred, ever. And there's a whole book there's all kinds of books on that. I think I don't think those stipulations were actual rules. I think they were hyperbolic ways for a community. But anyway, we have no evidence it ever happened. And certainly by this time period, we know they weren't stoned to death when someone had an affair. They just got divorced. That was the standard practice. If someone had an affair, you got divorced. You didn't go kill them. And this is no different. So what happens here is, what he did have a right to do was publicly shame her. He did have a right to tell everybody in the town, she's a whore, she slept around, it's over. But he's righteous, he knows the rules, but he wants to just divorce her quietly. Why do that? He's just being nice. It's just an act of grace. Because all he has to do to divorce is in a small ceremony to say, I divorce you. It's over between the witnesses and it's over. I mean, the whole town didn't have to know about it. It'd just be... Then she walks around with the baby. Either she moves off, but if she sticks around town, was that Joseph's baby? And he's like, not mine. And then, but he could have really ashamed her, which has made it much more difficult for her ever to remarry. Yeah, you're going to...
I just had a question.
Yeah.
Because if he hasn't even married her yet and she is a virgin, how's he divorcing her? He's stating that he would continue with the gift and stating that he would go through that and then quietly divorce her after the fact?
Good question. No, that's right. Good question. No, the divorce there is in the betrothal period because it's a legal contract. He's already signed to a legal contract. So it's legally binding. It's not being consummated yet. Okay. So at this level, had he received any dowry at all, and I'm not sure if it happened in betrothal or wait to the ceremony, I'm not sure. Even if he had, he would be able to keep it if it was proven that she was in the wrong. He only had to give it back if he divorced her. If that makes sense. So if he were at fault, he's liable, but not of her. He gets to keep it. And so he's just being kind. He knows the rules. He can divorce her I'll just divorce her quietly. But as he considered verse 20, as he considered this, that's Matthew's way of saying his mind's not made up. As he's pondering what to do about this whole situation, something happens that all ancient people thought happened all the time. God spoke in a dream. Ancient people thought dreams were like a middle road between this world and that world. So you had messages from the gods all the time. In Judaism, it doesn't show up that much, but you have people like Joseph who could interpret dreams in Genesis. You have Daniel who could interpret dreams in Daniel. Besides that, that's it. It shows up much more in the Greek Greco-Roman world. And probably one of the reasons is because so many texts in the Old Testament speak against divinizations and omens and so forth. Jews tend to downplay using them as guidelines, but it happened in the ancient world. That's how they saw it. And I got to go very, very fast here because we're out of time. He says, of course, Joseph, son of David, just in case our audience had forgotten already, that's the son of David. He's royalty. Son of David, son of David. Do not fear to take Mary, your wife, for that which is conceived of her is of the Holy Spirit. In the ancient world, there were stories of Greeks and Roman mythology where they came and had sex and impregnated the women, like Hercules and so forth. That is not the story. Skeptics always say, it's happened all in the ancient world. No, they didn't. The Jews never would have conceded that. God did not have genitalia. God the Father is not a man. They use male metaphors on purpose. The idea of conceived of her as of the Holy Spirit just means she has of the Holy Spirit. That's it. It doesn't explain how it happened. Well, how it happened, we know what it doesn't say. It doesn't say anything else. It doesn't say he was impregnated, a demon came over, none like that. There was no sex involved. And that's why I tried to make it clear earlier when it says Joseph before they came together. She has not sex, including God. God didn't have sex with her. She was just found to be. It just occurred. I mean,
It's a mystery.
it's a mystery. And so that means biologically the male spermatozoon was created. I mean, God would have had created from scratch. She's going to bear a son, and you can call him Yeshua. Yeshua. No, you're not going to call him named after your daddy, Joseph. Jacob. You're not going to name him Yaakov. You're going to call him Yeshua. Why is that? Because his name means something, and that is Yahweh saves. That's why he says it. For he will save his people from their sins. And of course, there almost certainly he doesn't mean, and then they die and go to heaven. It's the Old Testament sense, the biblical sense of save, meaning rescue from their sins, rescue from the effects of their sins, rescue from the effects of their sins. And most Jews at the time period believed that Jews were living in exile right now. They were like at home exile because foreigners were there. It's like when the Nazis took over France and you were to tell the other Frenchmen, I'm a Frenchman, and I go, we're living in exile. Well, I still live in the same home maps, but I'm in foreign land because it's been dominated by foreign people. The Jews said, yep, that's what's happened. It's because we must have sinned. And so those are the effects of our sin, that all this domination. Now, Matthew will go on to say Jesus had more than that there's demonic forces at work and sinful forces at work. But all this, he will save his people. And all this took place before the Lord has spoken by the prophet. Here, of course, he quotes Isaiah 7:14. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel, which does mean, it literally means in Hebrew, Emanu means with us, El means God, with us God. When Joseph woke from his sleep, it did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his wife. That means he married her, right? So he's obedient. He's a righteous man. But he knew her not until she had borne a son, and he called him Yeshua. Now notice it one more time. He knew her not until she had borne a son, which implies Joseph eventually did have sex with Mary. So that's one of those reasons why the word can mean brother, can mean cousin. Remember a little while ago when I said I'm going to find convincing for a few reasons? This is one of the reasons why. I think the most logical connection is that he didn't know her until means they did have sex, and later on we have brothers and sisters. I think it's the most natural reading of it. I see no reason to change it up. Emmanuel, God with us. That's from Isaiah 7:14. If you remember your Isaiah 7, King Ahaz wants to go to war. He's scared because Judah was curious about that, and Israel's curious about what do we do about this, and Syrians and others said, let's join together and fight. We can beat the Assyrians. And Isaiah goes to King Ahaz and says, don't do it. Don't do it. Do not go to war. I'm telling you, if you go to war with Israel, this alliance that's forming, you're going to be killed. Don't do it. In fact, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and before he can tell the difference between good, right, and wrong and eat curds and honey, they'll be annihilated. In other words, before this baby can be about 2 or 3 years old, I'm telling you, be over. And that's exactly what happened. What happened? 2 or 3 years, they came in Assyrians and demolished them. And had they joined in war, it would have wiped them out. In Isaiah chapter 8, the very next verse, it talks about the same person, and almost certainly it's Isaiah's wife who has the baby. So the analogy probably is Isaiah is pointing at his wife's belly, or something like that. I'm telling you, before the child is born, and you will call him Emmanuel, meaning that son, when he comes out, he is symbolically representing God is with us. He saved us because you didn't go to war. Trust me, by the time he's going to make it, he'll be born by the time he's old enough to finishes all his foods. I'm telling you, it's going to happen. That's what happens. Matthew said it's like that with Jesus. Most people say, no, that means Jesus is God with us. Maybe. I don't find that convincing. I go against everybody, and you can disagree with me. Every commentator, I think, gets this wrong. I think Matthew's point is it's like that with Jesus. When you see Jesus, you see that God the Father is saving people from their sins. Just like Isaiah's son, probably Isaiah's son, is pointing to the fact that God the Father saved them. When you see Jesus, and his name is Yeshua, not I save, but Yahweh saves. When you see me come in my mission, it's representing that God the Father is saving people all over again. I don't think they're dichotomically opposed. I'm not saying that's Jesus just a dude and God the Father does the saving. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is in this narrative so far, I think it's the point he's making. God the Father has been at work ever since Abraham, through all the generations to David, through all the generations of Babylon exile, all the way now to the guy, Joseph, who's related to King David. But he's been adopted by Joseph. That still counts. All this is God the Father orchestrating a saving event. So he's related to Abraham and his royalty. That's it. Now he goes on, and these so-called wise men come, and I'll save something briefly. But I'm going to pause for a second because I got to go real fast on this. I'm going to have to skip a lot. Any question or comment so far? So when we see Jesus, we know that God the Father is saving stuff. This next thing, I'm going to paraphrase. These wise men, they're not wise men. Okay, chapter 2, verse 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, that was around 4 BC. Herod the king died in 4 BC. Well, poor guy, Dionysius Exiguus II, the monk who made up our calendar, was wrong by about 4 to 6 years. That means Jesus had to have been born before Herod died. That's between 4 to 6 BC. So it's really not 2019. It's 2015, 2014. Just want you to know that. I thought that nerd junk when they're like, the millennial, year 2000 gonna mess up everything. It's not. It's 1996. It's not. We're not even yet. We're not there. Wait 2004, 2005. That's scary. Herod the king beheld, and it literally is Magi, wise men from the east, came to Jerusalem saying, "Where's the king to be born?" Oh man, there's so much there. They're not the wise men. Okay, what they are not is kings. The Greek word magi comes, the singular is magos. We get the word magician from there. Magician. That's the root of that. A magos was a particular person in a particular role in the ancient world, and everybody knew it. The magos was a kind of priestly astrologer, like their version of ancient scientist from the East. They would have been Persian, almost certainly of the Zoroastrian religion, and they were known for several things. And one of the things they were known for was watching the stars, these actual events, and saw them as omens. And Greeks and Romans and Jews, and even then, most people in the Mediterranean world thought that when some kind of significant astral event, we would call it a comet, or a certain constellation, or what's the word I'm looking for, when the moon's covered or something. Eclipses, conjunct, all that stuff. They go, it means something. The gods are up to something. They believed it so much that that Herod killed off a bunch of his own noble leaders when Halley's Comet passed by. So they would say, it was signifying their death, because he didn't want people to think it signified his death. And that kind of stuff happened all the time. So the fact that these magi from the south, but these magi come from far, it would have been long, let's say at least 1,200 miles. From the east, they head toward Jerusalem. Of course they do, because they're expecting, almost certainly, Herod the king must have born a son, because he's the king. And Herod, in fact, wasn't Jewish, though. It was Idumean. So when they come to town and say, where's the being king of the Jews? And he didn't have a baby boy on the way. No one's been born. Herod doesn't go, high five, tell me more about this great king to be born. Of course not. And nobody in Roman world, no one would have done that. They would have been very, very upset, because they would have taken their role seriously. If they come into town with a big fat caravan, and it would have been a caravan of all the stuff, and we later on find out they even brought gifts you give to a king that we know came from that route. If you go to ancient Petra, have you ever seen Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade? The last scene, I love that movie. The last scene, they go to this rock and the big music and the camera pans up, and they go inside, they see the big knight and all that stuff. Well, the outside is real. It's called Petra, and Greek just means rock. But on the inside, it was a studio. The outside's a real place, and the inside in real life is actually just a small room. But that's what used to sell spices like frankincense and myrrh. And that route goes from east to west. So it's very likely they could have passed by that route to come to Jerusalem. And they show up in town going, we built it. So they would have taken their presence very seriously. And you would not have kept it a secret, a big fat caravan of Persian-looking people who are known as the people whose job it is to watch the stars to see what happens and like big kings get born or they die. So when they come into town, woo! And that's Herod, of course, is not happy at all. He says, tell me, where is this great king to be born? And notice who has the answer. Remember the story? Who has the answer? The religious leadership, the scribes. They do. They go, oh, it must be Bethlehem. They start quoting Malachi. Of course it is. Micah. Of course it is, dummy. Of course, that's Matthew's way of saying the religious people who should have been looking for him all along weren't looking at all. But foreigners, 1,200 miles away, who are watching the stars, they knew to come and it's time to get born. And throughout Matthew's gospel, we see how the religious elite are always dumbfounded and obtuse and they're out of it. They're the ones that helped get Jesus crucified. But the foreigner, the Gentile, they were the ones, remember at the end too, all the way from Abraham, they're the ones that got us getting the outsiders getting included. So the Magi come in town, they go, tell me, well, the star comes up, and this is where almost all of it sounds like star, normal constellation stuff, normal stuff. Verse 7, he tried to figure out when the star appeared. He said, well, go and search the child. I might tell him worship him. He's a liar. But then all of a sudden, it's verse 9 that makes it sound supernatural. And that's it's weird because all the time, everything so far just sounds like a normal thing. And that's when it says, they went their way, the star which had been the east went before them till it came to rest over the place where the child was. Now, Jerusalem to Bethlehem is about, I think it's under 6 miles. So if you had a telescope, that's a minuscule change in the sky. Think about that for a second, how minuscule it is to go 6 miles. To really see a different 6 miles, that star had been a mile over the earth. That doesn't happen. If a star got a mile to the earth, we'd all been torched. So it can't literally be a star. Let's just use some physics for a second. And I'm convinced most people are. That's not Matthew's point. At some level, his point, it seems to me, is this is a supernatural event in that God is leading these Magi exactly where they should go. And they go straight to Bethlehem. And they go to Bethlehem. Now, exactly how that works out with stars, whatever, go for it. When they saw, they go crazy excited that, as it were, at rest, God led them. They go in the house. It had been easy to search every place that had babies in Bethlehem is a lot bigger than Nazareth, but it's still a small town. What we would call small. They find them. They fall on their feet, fall down on their face rather, and they worship him. The word proskuneo means to bow down. The Latin word is genuflect, to pay homage toward. You can say worship. The problem with the worship is that we use it in church language. So worship sounds like all the time means someone thinks the other person's God. If I worship Aaron at your feet, it means no, I'm not God. We use the word worship as a religious sense. They didn't. It could be that way, but the exact same words were used when you got in front of people who are higher social status than you were. Kings, emperors, even just higher patrons. You might bow down their feet. You would proskuneo, you worship. And so they do worship. The problem is, and I've heard this all the time in church, even they knew he was God in the flesh. My response is maybe, but the reason why that preacher just said that is because they read an English word called worship, and they don't realize, does that make sense? I'm not being mean, but there's no reason to think these guys think Jesus is anything but the King of the Jews, as what they called him, not is born God. God wasn't born anyway. They don't say that. Where is to be born the King of the Jews? They think this is the King, which would have been
I guess that's
crazy.
going to be my question of where the confusion of worship would be, because if you're thinking prestige and bowing down, I mean, even if we bow to the Queen of England or whatever it might be, it doesn't mean that we're worshiping her, but there's a prestige to that level.
Right, but in Old English they use the word worship for what you just described. But
and that's how I read it.
That's
So
right.
It's a prestige, not because he's God.
Oh, okay,
because
gotcha.
he's a king,
Because he's king, good.
because they've
Good.
claimed him to be a king.
Good for you. Well, my experience, most people don't. Most people, in my experience, use worship, unless you're using it as an idiom, like we worship an actor or actress. I just worship him. Everyone, in my experience, they know that means they're using it hyperbolically.
Right.
That is, you're not really worshiping, because if you're really worshiping, that's religious. And does that make most people might? It doesn't have to be your experience, but I'm saying is, in the Old and New Testament, that's false. In the ancient world, they don't assume worship is religious. It just means to pay homage toward, or someone's higher prestige. Yeah, that's right. It can be used to bow down to God. It just means, okay. Well, anyway, so they open the treasures. Of course, they offer three things. It's not because Jesus likes to eat gold. He's a baby. Or frankincense and myrrh. It's because these are gifts you give to a king. It's not because they are kings. It's because you're coming to a king. Well, this is the three gifts, is why people think there are only three of them. Maybe so. The text doesn't say. It says he got three gifts. And by the medieval ages, you started having names attributed to these three kings. They're not kings. For sure, they're not kings. They're Persian astrologers. They're magi. Secondly, they gave these gifts because Jesus was considered to be a king. Period. And we don't know how many there were, and we don't know their names. Almost certainly they would have been part of a caravan of all kinds of servants and probably several magi and whatever. But
And they didn't show up at the manger.
I think we don't know where they showed up, except they go and find the home. But in Matthew, there's no reference of angels, no reference of a manger, none of that stuff. So if it's there, Matthew omitted all of that. What I mean is, if it occurred this way, in Matthew's mind, he deliberately omitted it, and there's different theories about why he would omit it. But anyway, that's right. Oh, now she goes in to, but the fact that it says where the child was, and in verse 11, going into the house, that does fit Luke's narrative well, that they go into a house. And I'll about in a second. One quick thing, if I can, about why do we do December 25th? We have no idea when this happens. Now, later on in Luke's gospel, we'll go ahead and turn very quickly to Luke chapter 2. But it's, maybe. We'll talk about this. Maybe so. The text never says when he's born. We have no idea. The only thing we have at all, if we take Luke's narrative as historical, and that is they were watching their sheep by night, which means it had been hot during the day, not winter. It had been more summer, fall. So it can't be literally December, because the shepherds would not have been watching in the nighttime. December 25th actually comes from several different ideas, and there are different theories. And there's a lot of theories. But the date of December 25th was offered as the birth of Jesus around the late 2nd century. And it probably comes from the idea that a lot of ancient people at the time thought March 25th was literally the first day of creation. They thought that probably because they thought March 25th was the vernal equinox. It's the day of this days start getting longer, But technically they're off. It's March 20th to 21st. But their date was March 25th. And they thought, well, if it's the day where the days started getting longer, it must have been the first day of creation. Well, that must have been the day when the light of the world was coming into what's 9 months before March 25th. I mean, after, right? It's December 25th. So that is that she got impregnated, or she had, he was conceived March 25th and born December 25th. Some say no, it's because the first day of creation was March 25th, so it had to be 9 days. I mean, that kind of stuff. So it just becomes kind of theology. We just don't know. In the early 3rd century, there became made popular a Roman holiday called Saturnalia. And there's a few of them, in fact. But that day celebrated, it was kind of religious, but not really. It celebrated old veterans and so forth. But some people say, no, Christmas, December 25th, was nothing but a baptized Roman holiday. The problem with that is what I just said, which is Christians were already proffering December 25th as a date before the Romans established that as a holiday. Now, is it possible by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, Christians started to celebrate it real on the 25th to compete with that Roman? Maybe. But the origins can't be from that, because they were already saying the date way before the Romans made up that date of December 25th for their Roman festivities. But around 525, I think it was 525, yep, Pope John I officially said December 25th is the official date. He said he commissioned one of his monks, Dionysius Exiguus II, to figure out the calendar, and he's the one, that monk, that said it was on December 25th is when he was born. And he made up the whole yearly calendar, and he was wrong on the year, and we have no idea when he was born. But if you go by Luke, it was not in the winter. There's no way. I shouldn't say no way. Very, very unlikely.